Hey guys, settle here. Tonight we're stepping into a world where travel wasn't a weekend hobby. It was a slow, dusty gamble. A world where the road was not romantic. It was loud, uncomfortable, and occasionally trying to kill you. Tonight, we begin with 15 forgotten instant meals medieval pilgrims ate on the road. Food that could be prepared quickly. Food that didn't require a kitchen. Food that didn't demand fresh ingredients. And food that, most importantly, did not betray you halfway between towns. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Because I always love seeing how far these quiet little journeys reach. Now dim the lights. Get your blanket. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's road together. When we imagine medieval pilgrims, we tend to picture one of two things. Either a saintly figure, glowing with divine purpose. Or a miserable person in rags, being attacked by every disease known to man. In reality, most pilgrims were somewhere in between. Ordinary people. Tired people. People who believed the journey mattered. But also people who, very practically, needed to eat. And the medieval road was not lined with convenient restaurants. Yes, there were inns. Yes, there were monasteries. Yes, there were towns. But in between those points was a lot of nothing. And on a long pilgrimage, whether to Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or Jerusalem, you could not rely on always finding food at the perfect time. So pilgrims carried their own. And what they carried tended to fall into one category. Foods that survived. Not foods that impressed. Not foods that delighted. Not foods that made anyone say, wow, this is restaurant quality. Just foods that refused to spoil. Foods that didn't panic when the weather changed. Foods that didn't require careful handling. Foods that could be eaten while walking, resting, or quietly regretting your choices. The first thing that shows up again and again in medieval travel is bread, but not the soft warm kind you imagine from a bakery. The road did not reward softness. Soft bread molds. Soft bread collapses. Soft bread becomes a fuzzy science experiment in your bag. So pilgrims leaned on bread that had been baked hard on purpose. Hardtack, ship's biscuit, dry rounds, dense loaves that felt more like building material than dinner. Flour, water, maybe salt, and then baked until it was dry enough to survive a week of rain and a month of sun. It was portable, stackable, and stubborn. It could be thrown into a satchel without thinking. It could survive being sat on. It could survive being forgotten. Eating it, however, was another matter. Hard bread isn't chewed. Hard bread is negotiated with. You don't take a bite so much as you attempt a bite. Your teeth meet resistance. Your jaw begins to question your lifestyle. And you realize that medieval pilgrims probably had excellent jaw strength right up until the moment they didn't. So they softened it whenever they could. In broth. In water. In ale. Sometimes even in wine if they were lucky. But if there was nothing, they chewed slowly and stared into the middle distance, thinking about how faith was apparently not meant to be comfortable. Bread alone kept you alive, but bread alone didn't keep you satisfied. So the next thing pilgrims loved was cheese. Cheese was one of the great travel foods of medieval Europe. Because it was milk transformed into something stable. Something durable. Something that could last longer than fresh dairy ever could. Fresh milk spoiled quickly. Butter could go rancid. But hard cheese, especially the kind made to be aged, could survive the road. Pilgrims carried wedges wrapped in cloth. The cloth wasn't just for cleanliness. It helped protect the cheese while letting it breathe slightly. And cheese did something bread could not. It gave fat. It gave protein. It gave that feeling of substance that told your body, yes, you are still a human being and not a wandering grain-based machine. Sometimes the cheese was sharp. Sometimes it was dry. Sometimes it became so strong that it practically announced itself before you even unwrapped it. But even that had a strange benefit. Strong flavors broke the monotony. They gave the senses something to focus on besides dust and foot pain. And on a long pilgrimage, anything that distracted you from the road was valuable. Then there was the simplest medieval travel flavor enhancer of all. Onions. Bread and onions. Cheese and onions. Onion and anything. Onions were easy to grow, easy to store, and unlike leafy vegetables, they didn't wilt into sadness after 2 days. They stayed firm. They stayed stubborn. They traveled well. A pilgrim could carry onions tied in cloth or tucked into a pouch, and eat them raw with bread. It was not a gentle meal. It was not polite. But it was practical. And people believed onions helped protect against illness. Medieval medicine was a chaotic mix of tradition and superstition, but onions do contain nutrients. They also made you smell powerful, which on a medieval road may have been useful. If you're going to smell like sweat anyway, you might as well commit to a theme. Of course, a diet of bread, cheese, and onion could carry you only so far before your body began quietly asking for something more. Something filling. Something warm. Something that felt like an actual meal. And that's where dried peas came in. Dried peas were one of the most important medieval foods for ordinary people, and they were perfect for travel. Cheap, durable, and packed with protein and fiber. Fresh peas spoiled quickly, but dried peas could sit in a bag for weeks. When camp was made and water was boiled, peas could be poured in and left to soften. Within minutes, they turned into a thick mash. Not glamorous, but filling. The kind of food that sits in your stomach and says, "You will not collapse today." Warm food mattered psychologically. Medieval travel was cold, even in summer. Nights were cold. Wind was constant. Rain was common. So when pilgrims could stop and cook something, peas were ideal. They didn't require delicate timing. They didn't require spices. They didn't require a skilled cook. They just required water and patience. And patience, on a medieval road, was abundant. And then there was pottage, the true medieval default meal. Pottage wasn't one recipe. It was an idea. A thick stew made from grains, peas, onions, herbs, and whatever else could be found. It was flexible. It was cheap. It was basically medieval life in a bowl. For pilgrims, pottage could be made even more convenient by preparing the ingredients in advance. Cracked grains, dried peas, dried herbs, maybe a pinch of salt. Carried as a dry mix, it became medieval instant soup. Add boiling water, stir, wait, and suddenly you had something that resembled dinner. Not because it was delicious, but because it was warm and thick and real. Now, for protein, medieval pilgrims often relied on something that modern people find both fascinating and slightly alarming. Salted fish. Medieval Europe ran on salt, and it ran on fish. Especially in Christian regions where fasting days were common. Herring, cod, eel, whatever could be preserved. Fish was salted heavily, sometimes dried, sometimes smoked. And once preserved, it became travel food. Compact, high protein, and long-lasting. You could eat it with bread immediately. No cooking required. Just pull out a strip, bite, and accept the experience. Salted fish was not subtle. It smelled like the ocean decided to become aggressive. But it was effective. And on the road, effectiveness wins. Salt also helped replenish what you lost through sweat. And pilgrims sweated. Not in the delicate modern gym way. In the constant, unavoidable medieval travel way. One of the most quietly common medieval road meals was bread softened in ale. It sounds odd now, but it was practical. Ale was often safer than water. It provided calories. And it softened hard bread into something edible. Pilgrims would pour ale into a bowl or cup and let bread sit until it became soft enough to eat without feeling like you were filing your teeth down. It was simple. It was efficient. And it's one of those little details that makes medieval travel feel suddenly real. Because people weren't trying to be dramatic. They were trying to make dinner happen with what they had. And after days of salt and grain and onions, the body starts asking for something else. Something sweet. Not for luxury, but for energy. Dried fruit was the medieval answer. Apples, pears, plums, raisins, and in some regions, figs. Dried fruit was portable, durable, and it provided quick fuel. It also provided the illusion of freshness. A dried plum after 3 days of porridge feels like a gift. Not because it's fancy, but because it's different. And difference is comfort. Nuts were another perfect travel food. Walnuts, hazelnuts, chestnuts in certain regions. Dense, high fat, high calorie. Easy to carry. Easy to eat. No cooking, no tools, just crack and chew. Nuts were calm food. They didn't spoil easily. They didn't leak. They didn't mold quickly. They sat quietly in your pouch, waiting to be useful. And on a medieval road, quiet usefulness was one of the most valuable qualities a food could have. And if a pilgrim wanted the closest thing to an energy bar, they reached for honey. Honey didn't spoil. It could be stored in small containers. And a little honey on bread could transform a miserable meal into something tolerable. It also delivered fast energy, which mattered when you've been walking all day and your legs felt like they were made of medieval regret. Honey was also considered medicinal. People believed it helped wounds, helped sore throats, helped strength. And while medieval medicine was often wrong in fascinating ways, honey is genuinely antibacterial. So in this one case, medieval instinct was actually onto something. And at this point, the pilgrim's bag is starting to look like a medieval survival kit. Bread that refuses to die. Cheese wrapped in cloth. Onions for flavor and stubbornness. Dried peas for warmth. Pottage mix for convenience. Salted fish for protein. Dried fruit and nuts for quick energy. Honey for sweetness and morale. A simple collection of foods designed not for pleasure, but for endurance. And endurance was the true currency of the medieval road. Because the pilgrimage wasn't only about faith. It was also about the long, repetitive rhythm of travel. The sound of footsteps. The creak of leather straps. The distant bell of a town that might still be hours away. And when the sun lowered and the wind cooled, and the road turned from dusty to quiet, a pilgrim's meal didn't need to impress anyone. It only needed to keep them moving. And once you start thinking about medieval pilgrim food as a survival kit, you begin noticing something. A pilgrimage was not one long dramatic moment. It was thousands of small moments. Thousands of small decisions. When to rest. When to push forward. When to eat. How much to eat. And what to save for later. Because food on the road was not only nourishment. It was time management. It was risk management. It was mood management. A person could survive hunger. But hunger makes you reckless. Hunger makes you angry. Hunger makes you more likely to argue with the people walking beside you. And when you are already tired, already sore, already sleeping in strange places with strangers, the last thing you want is internal conflict over rations. So medieval pilgrims developed a kind of quiet discipline around food. And that discipline shows up in the next kind of meal that appears again and again in records of travel. Something small, portable, and shockingly modern in concept. A simple meat ration. Not a roast. Not a stew. Not anything requiring cooking. Just cured meat. Dried or smoked strips of pork or beef. Sometimes salted sausage. Sometimes a piece of bacon cured hard enough to survive being carried for days. Fresh meat was a problem on the road. Fresh meat demanded speed. Fresh meat demanded careful cooking. Fresh meat demanded you eat it before it turned into a punishment. But cured meat was patient. Cured meat could sit quietly in a pouch. And when you needed it, you could slice off a piece with a small knife and eat it with bread. It wasn't tender. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't designed to melt in your mouth. It was designed to stay alive in your bag. And the pilgrim diet needed that. Because the medieval road was unpredictable. You might plan to reach a town by evening. But then rain comes. Or a swollen river blocks your path. Or you take a wrong turn. Or your feet decide they have reached their limit. And suddenly the town is not tonight. It is tomorrow. And that's when cured meat becomes the difference between discomfort and real weakness. It provided protein. It provided fat. And it gave you the sense that you were eating something substantial. Something that could actually carry you through a long day. Now, if cured meat was the road's blunt tool for strength, there was another medieval travel food that played a different role. A quieter role. A background role. But an essential one. Salt. Pilgrims carried salt. Sometimes in a small pouch. Sometimes in a little wrapped bundle. Sometimes in a tiny container. Because salt did not just make food taste better. Salt made food possible. It preserved. It stabilized. It kept things from turning. And it also helped the body keep going. People didn't talk about electrolytes. They didn't talk about mineral balance. But they understood that after long days of sweating, salt mattered. And if you were eating mostly grain and dried food, salt helped make it feel like a meal instead of punishment. Salt also had social value. If you had salt, you could trade. You could offer it. You could share it. And sharing food on the road was one of the quiet ways pilgrims formed temporary communities. The medieval world was not always kind. But travelers often recognized one another as fellow sufferers. And in suffering, people become strangely generous. Now, not all medieval pilgrim meals were eaten from a bag. Sometimes the road offered something else. Something that feels very familiar to modern people. Street food. Not in the way we imagine it today, with bright signs and menus. But in the simple sense of food sold quickly, cheaply, to people passing through. When pilgrims reached a town, they might buy a bowl of broth. A piece of bread. A pie. A small cake. A roasted onion. A handful of beans. And the most common fast food in many medieval towns was something so basic, it almost disappears into the background. A bowl of thick soup. Broth with grain. Broth with peas. Broth with onion. Broth with whatever was available. It wasn't a restaurant experience. It was fuel. And for a pilgrim who had been eating hard bread for days, a bowl of warm soup could feel like a miracle. Not because it was delicious. But because it was warm. And warmth is a kind of comfort you don't fully appreciate until you've been cold for too long. This is one of the reasons monasteries became such important places on pilgrimage routes. Because monasteries often provided food. Not always. Not for everyone. But many did. Some offered charity. Some offered hospitality. Some offered a place to sleep and a bowl of something warm. And if you were a pilgrim arriving at a monastery after a long day, the food might be simple. But it would be stable. It would be cooked. It would be safe. And safe food mattered. Because the medieval road had another hidden danger besides hunger. Bad water. Water was unpredictable. Sometimes it was clean. Sometimes it was not. Sometimes it looked clean and still made you sick. And sickness on the road was terrifying. Not in a dramatic way. In a slow way. In the way where you realize your body is failing you far from home. So pilgrims often preferred ale. Small beer. Weak beer. Not strong, not for drunkenness, but for safety. Because the brewing process killed pathogens. And beer was a calorie source. It wasn't just a drink. It was a kind of liquid bread. This is why beer shows up so often in medieval travel accounts. Not as indulgence. As practicality. A pilgrim might carry a small flask. Or buy ale at inns. Or drink what was offered. And that ale would soften bread, calm hunger, and make the road slightly more bearable. And when ale wasn't available, pilgrims might drink watered wine, especially in regions where wine was more common. The idea of drinking straight from a stream might feel romantic now. But medieval travelers learned quickly that romance is not worth dysentery. Now, there's another travel meal that deserves attention. Because it's the medieval version of something we all know. Something that feels modern. Something that feels like the ancestor of the snack aisle. Small baked goods. Little cakes. Biscuits. Buns. Not sweet in the modern sense, because sugar was expensive. But sometimes made with honey. Sometimes with dried fruit. Sometimes with spices if you had money. These baked goods were portable. They could be eaten quickly. They could be stored for a few days. And they were often sold in towns to travelers. For a pilgrim, buying a small cake was not just hunger management. It was morale. It was a tiny reminder that life contained pleasure. Even on the road. Even when your feet hurt. Even when your clothes were damp. Even when your back ached. A small cake was not necessary. But it made you feel human. And feeling human mattered. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking that medieval pilgrim food sounds repetitive. You are correct. It was repetitive. It was intentionally repetitive. Because variety is expensive. Variety requires fresh ingredients. Fresh ingredients require timing. And timing is not guaranteed on the road. So pilgrims built their diet around foods that were boring but stable. And stability was survival. But even in that boredom, medieval travelers found small tricks. Small upgrades. And one of those upgrades was herbs. Not fancy herbs. Not delicate bundles. Dried herbs. Sage. Thyme. Maybe parsley. Sometimes mint. Sometimes garlic, dried or carried fresh for a few days. These herbs were used to flavor pottage. To improve broth. To mask the taste of fish. To make dried peas feel less like you were eating punishment. And herbs also had another role. Medicine. In the medieval world, the line between food and medicine was thin. People believed certain herbs strengthened the body. Protected against illness. Improved digestion. And whether or not those beliefs were always correct, herbs did have real effects. Mint could calm the stomach. Garlic could help with infections. Sage had antimicrobial properties. So carrying herbs was both culinary and practical. And it also made your food feel slightly more intentional. Because there is something about seasoning that tells the brain, this is a meal. This is not just survival. Now, another forgotten instant meal of medieval pilgrims was something you wouldn't expect. Eggs. Not fresh eggs carried for weeks, obviously. But hard-boiled eggs eaten soon after leaving a town. If you stayed at an inn, or bought food in a market, hard-boiled eggs were a quick protein source. Easy to eat. Easy to carry for a day or two. And when eaten with bread and salt, they made a simple, satisfying meal. They were not long-term travel food. But they were transitional food. The kind of thing you eat between stable rations and the next town. And medieval travel was full of transitions. Now, let's talk about one of the most important and overlooked medieval travel foods. Oats. Oats were cheap. Oats were filling. Oats cooked quickly. And oats could be turned into a thick porridge with minimal effort. For pilgrims in northern Europe especially, oats were a common staple. A small pouch of oats could become a warm meal with only water and heat. And if you had honey, you could sweeten it. If you had salt, you could stabilize it. If you had dried fruit, you could improve it. Oat porridge was medieval meal prep. It was also extremely practical. Because oats cook faster than many grains. And on the road, faster cooking meant less time exposed. Less time sitting still. Less time with a fire visible. Less time vulnerable. That might sound dramatic, but medieval roads were not always safe. Bandits existed. Theft existed. Violence existed. And if you were a pilgrim with limited protection, you didn't want to advertise your presence for too long. So meals that cooked quickly were valuable. Now, as the pilgrimage continued, one of the most common psychological challenges was monotony. Not just food monotony. Road monotony. Day after day of walking. The same rhythm. The same aches. The same dust. And food became one of the few controllable experiences. One of the few places you could introduce change. So pilgrims sometimes carried small luxuries. Not luxuries like jewelry. Luxuries like spices. A pinch of pepper if you were wealthy. A bit of cinnamon. A bit of cloves. Not much. Just enough to flavor food. Spices were expensive. But pilgrims who could afford them sometimes carried tiny amounts. And those tiny amounts could transform a pot of peas into something that felt almost festive. A pilgrim might not have had a bed. They might not have had dry clothes. But they could have a pinch of pepper in their soup. And that mattered. Because the medieval mind, like the modern mind, responds strongly to small pleasures in hard conditions. Now, another road meal that appears in medieval travel was something extremely humble. A bowl of beans. Beans were cheap. Beans stored well when dried. Beans were filling. And like peas, they became soft and edible when boiled. Different regions had different varieties. Fava beans were common. Other legumes too. Beans were not glamorous, but they were powerful. They provided protein. They provided bulk. And they created that heavy, satisfying fullness that kept you moving. Beans were also the kind of food that could be shared easily. A pot of beans could feed multiple people. And on pilgrimage routes, people often traveled in loose groups. Not always formal caravans. But clusters of travelers. A few strangers who found themselves walking at the same pace. Sharing the same destination. Sharing the same risks. And when you travel with others, shared meals become social glue. They reduce fear. They reduce loneliness. They create a sense of community. Even if only for a few days. Now, one of the strangest things about medieval pilgrim travel is how modern some of the food logic feels. The idea of durable carbs. Portable protein. Fast meals. Food that doesn't spoil. Food that doesn't require complicated cooking. This is not ancient mystery. This is human logic. Humans have always been trying to solve the same problem. How do you eat while moving? How do you carry calories across distance? How do you keep food from betraying you? And medieval pilgrims solved it with the tools they had. Grain. Salt. Smoke. Fermentation. Drying. Patience. Now, we haven't yet talked about one of the most important medieval travel foods. And one of the most misunderstood. Because modern people often assume medieval travelers were always starving. But starvation wasn't the default. The default was blandness. The default was repetitive meals. And the thing that made those meals tolerable was fat. Fat was precious. Fat was fuel. Fat was comfort. And pilgrims carried fat when they could. A small lump of lard. A piece of bacon fat. Rendered animal fat stored in a container. It could be added to porridge. Added to peas. Spread thinly on bread. And that small addition changed everything. Because fat makes food satisfying. Fat makes food feel rich. Fat keeps you full longer. And on a cold road, fat also helped the body maintain warmth. So a pilgrim with access to fat had a significant advantage. Not an advantage in luxury. An advantage in endurance. Now, imagine the scene. A pilgrim stops at dusk. Maybe under a tree. Maybe near a hedge. Maybe beside a road where others pass. A small fire. A small pot. Water. A handful of oats. A pinch of salt. A little fat melted in. And suddenly you have something warm. Something thick. Something that feels like food rather than ration. The road doesn't feel kind. But for a few minutes, you feel stable. And that stability is what keeps you going. Because the pilgrimage is not a single heroic act. It is thousands of ordinary acts. Putting one foot forward. Eating another piece of bread. Saving a little cheese for later. Drinking ale. Sleeping. Waking. Continuing. And in that repetition, these forgotten instant meals become the quiet engine of the journey. They don't appear in paintings. They don't appear in epic poems. But they are what made the pilgrimage possible. Now, as we continue, we'll move deeper into the road culture. The inns. The monasteries. The ways pilgrims actually cooked. The way they bought food. The way they stored food. And the way the road itself shaped what people ate. Because the medieval road didn't just change the body. It changed the diet. It changed the mind. And it changed what a meal even meant. So as the night settles in and the road grows quiet in your imagination, we'll keep walking together. Slowly. Calmly. One step at a time. One simple meal at a time. And we'll let the medieval world do what it always does best. Reveal itself in small, practical details. The kind of details that never make it into grand history books. But quietly kept people alive. And as the journey stretches onward, something becomes clear very quickly. Medieval pilgrimage wasn't just about walking. It was about learning how to live on the edge of certainty. Because in a town, life has structure. You know where the well is. You know where food is sold. You know where you can sleep. You know what the rules are. But on the road, everything becomes conditional. If the weather holds. If your shoes survive. If you find shelter. If you reach the next village before dark. And food becomes one of the few things you can control. Not completely, but enough to feel grounded. That is why medieval pilgrims carried foods that were almost aggressively reliable. Foods that didn't demand attention. Foods that didn't spoil easily. Foods that didn't require skill. Foods that didn't punish you for being tired. And one of the most reliable foods of all, strangely enough, was something that sounds too simple to mention. A plain handful of grain. Not flour. Not baked. Not cooked. Just grain. Wheat kernels. Barley. Sometimes rye. Sometimes oats. Carried in a small pouch. And eaten raw in small amounts, especially in moments when stopping to cook wasn't possible. This wasn't a feast. This was not even a proper meal. This was emergency fuel. A handful of grain could be chewed slowly while walking. Not pleasant, but effective. And it had a particular advantage. It didn't require fire. Fire was not always safe. Fire was not always possible. Fire required time. Fire required fuel. And fuel wasn't guaranteed. Wood could be wet. Wood could be scarce. In some regions, wood could be guarded. So raw grain became a kind of medieval backup plan. The food equivalent of having coins hidden in your shoe. Now, the road also taught pilgrims something else. The value of small tools. Because food is not only about what you carry. It's about what you can do with it. A pilgrim with a knife had power. Not power in a dramatic way. Power in a practical way. They could cut cheese. Slice meat. Split bread. Peel onions. Carve wood. And even defend themselves if they had to. The knife was not just a weapon. It was a cooking tool. And on the medieval road, cooking tools were survival tools. A pilgrim might also carry a small spoon. Sometimes wood. Sometimes bone. Sometimes metal if they could afford it. And that spoon mattered because so much travel food became porridge. Peas. Beans. Oats. Pottage. And eating thick hot food with your hands is possible, but not ideal. So the spoon became a quiet symbol of civilization on the road. It meant you could eat without chaos. It meant you could share food more cleanly. It meant you could feel like a person, not an animal. Now, as pilgrims moved through different regions, their food changed slightly. Not dramatically. But enough to notice. In Northern Europe, oats were common. In Southern Europe, wheat was more common. In wine regions, watered wine replaced ale. In coastal regions, salted fish was everywhere. In inland regions, cured meat became more important. In areas with orchards, dried apples and pears were common. In areas with vineyards, raisins and dried grapes appeared. And on the road to Santiago de Compostela, for example, pilgrims would encounter a mix of French, Spanish, and regional foods that slowly shifted as the landscape changed. Food became a map. A quiet, edible map. Now, one of the most fascinating things about medieval pilgrimage is how much of it depended on hospitality. Not guaranteed hospitality. Not universal hospitality. But enough that pilgrims learned to seek it. Monasteries, as we said, were key points. But there were also hospitals. Not hospitals in the modern sense. But places that offered shelter, sometimes food, sometimes care. And pilgrims would plan routes around these places. Because shelter was not just about sleep. Shelter was about cooking. If you could sleep somewhere with a hearth, you could cook. If you could cook, your food supply lasted longer. If your food supply lasted longer, you could travel farther. So a warm hearth was not a luxury. It was a strategic resource. Now, another instant meal that appears on medieval roads is something we rarely think of as travel food today. Cold leftovers. When pilgrims stayed at inns, they might receive a meal. A stew. A pot of beans. A piece of meat. And they would save what they could. Not because they were greedy. Because the road trained you to never waste food. So a pilgrim might wrap leftovers in cloth and carry them for the next day. This was risky, of course. Food could spoil. But if it was cold weather, or if the food was heavily salted, it might survive long enough. And the next day, a pilgrim could eat cold stew with bread. Not pleasant. But filling. And again, medieval travel was not about pleasure. It was about function. Now, let's talk about something that was both food and medicine. Garlic. Garlic was one of the most common travel companions. It lasted longer than many vegetables. It could be carried easily. It flavored bland food. And people believed it protected against illness. Garlic appears constantly in medieval life because it was cheap, available, and powerful. A pilgrim might rub garlic on bread. Add it to pottage. Chew a clove raw if they felt unwell. And even if garlic wasn't a miracle cure, it did have antimicrobial properties. It also had another advantage. It discouraged close conversation. which, on a crowded medieval road, might have been a form of protection. Now, we should pause for a moment and acknowledge something. Medieval pilgrims were not always poor. Some were. Many were. But not all. There were wealthy pilgrims too. Nobles. Merchants. People who could afford horses, servants, and better food. And their travel meals looked different. They might carry better bread. Better cheese. More spices. More meat. They might buy fresh food more often. They might stop at better inns. But even wealthy pilgrims had to respect the road. Because the road equalized people. It didn't care about your status. It cared about your endurance. And even a wealthy traveler eventually faced the same problems. Food spoils. Water is risky. Weather changes. The body gets tired. And when those things happen, the same reliable foods appear. Bread. Cheese. Dried fruit. Cured meat. Grain. Salt. The medieval road did not reward luxury. It rewarded preparation. Now, there is another instant meal that medieval pilgrims ate that feels almost too ordinary to mention. But it was everywhere. Cabbage. Not fresh cabbage carried for weeks. But cabbage in preserved form. Pickled cabbage. Salted cabbage. Fermented cabbage. In different regions, this appeared in different ways. But the logic was the same. Fresh vegetables spoiled quickly. Preserved vegetables lasted. And preserved vegetables did something vital. They broke monotony. They added sourness. They added crunch. They added that sharp taste that wakes up the mouth. And medieval travelers, just like modern travelers, craved texture. They craved something that wasn't soft. Because so much road food became soft. Porridge. Stew. Soaked bread. Mash. A bite of pickled cabbage could feel like a reset. Like waking up. And it also helped with digestion. Fermented food supported the gut, even if medieval people didn't describe it that way. They just knew that certain foods made you feel better. Now, one of the quiet challenges of medieval travel was that the body changes. You walk more. You sweat more. You sleep less. You eat differently. And digestion becomes unpredictable. Some pilgrims suffered constipation. Some suffered diarrhea. Some suffered nausea. And food choices mattered. Oats helped. Dried fruit helped. Beans helped, sometimes too much. And pilgrims learned to balance. Not with modern nutritional knowledge. But with experience. If you eat too much salted fish, your thirst increases. If you eat too many beans, your stomach becomes a battlefield. If you eat only bread, your energy becomes unstable. So pilgrims adjusted. They learned to eat small amounts more often. They learned to save certain foods for certain moments. They learned to treat their bags like a pantry. Now, another road meal that deserves mention is something that sounds simple but was incredibly important. Milk, but not fresh. In some regions, pilgrims could buy sour milk. Or buttermilk. Or fermented dairy drinks. These lasted longer than fresh milk and were easier to digest for some people. They provided calories and protein. And they were refreshing. Especially in warmer climates. Fermented dairy was one of those foods that traveled better than you'd expect. Not across weeks, but across days. And on a pilgrimage, days matter. Because most pilgrims were moving town to town. Not across empty wilderness for months. So a food that could last 1 or 2 days was still useful. Now, as we continue deeper into medieval travel, we also begin to notice the economic side of food. Pilgrims didn't just eat what they carried. They ate what they could buy. And medieval towns along pilgrimage routes developed businesses around pilgrims. Bakers, butchers, ale sellers, cheese makers, people selling pies, people selling cheap bowls of stew. And these businesses were often simple and practical. Pilgrims didn't want fancy. Pilgrims wanted filling. Pilgrims wanted cheap. Pilgrims wanted safe. So certain foods became pilgrimage route classics. One of them was the humble pie. Not a sweet pie. A meat pie. Or a fish pie. Or a vegetable pie. The pastry acted like packaging. It held the filling. It protected it. It made it portable. And a pilgrim could buy a pie and carry it for hours. Eat it while walking. Eat it at rest. Share it with others. The pie was medieval fast food. It was also medieval meal prep. And it was brilliant. Because pastry is a kind of edible container. And medieval people loved edible containers. They reduced mess. They reduced waste. They made food portable. Now, another road meal was the simple boiled egg we mentioned earlier, but we can extend that concept. Eggs also appeared in baked goods. In enriched bread. In small cakes. In pancakes cooked on a hearth. If pilgrims stayed somewhere with cooking facilities, they might make simple pancakes from flour and eggs. Not sweet. Just basic. A quick, warm meal. And again, the logic was always the same. Quick. Filling. Reliable. Now, as the journey continues, pilgrims also begin to encounter foods from other cultures. Especially on longer routes. A pilgrim traveling toward Rome might encounter Italian food traditions. Olives. Olive oil. Different cheeses. Different breads. A pilgrim moving toward Jerusalem might encounter completely different flavors. Dried dates. Sesame. Spices. Flatbreads. And for many medieval Europeans, these foods felt foreign. But also exciting. Food became one of the ways the world expanded. Even for people who couldn't read maps. Even for people who didn't speak the languages. They could taste the difference. They could taste geography. Now, we haven't yet talked about one of the most quietly important medieval travel foods. And that is oil. Especially olive oil in southern regions. Oil was portable. It was calorie-dense. It improved food instantly. A little oil on bread made it softer, richer, more satisfying. Oil added fat without requiring meat. And in fasting seasons, oil was especially valuable. Because medieval Christians had many fasting days where meat was restricted. So oil became a way to keep food satisfying without breaking religious rules. And pilgrims were often deeply aware of these rules. Not because they were perfect. But because pilgrimage itself was a religious act. So food was not only survival. It was also morality. Now, as the road continues, we begin to see the pilgrim diet as something like a rhythm. Hard foods. Soft foods. Salty foods. Sour foods. Occasional sweet. Occasional fresh. Mostly preserved. Mostly durable. And that rhythm kept people going. Because the road was long. And the body, if given steady fuel, can do astonishing things. It can walk across countries. It can survive cold nights. It can endure rain. It can carry pain and keep moving. Not because it is heroic. But because it adapts. And medieval pilgrims adapted. They adapted their feet. They adapted their minds. And they adapted their meals. And these meals, these quiet, stubborn foods, were the invisible companions of every step. Now, as we continue, we'll move into something even more interesting. The way pilgrims ate together. The way they shared. The way they argued. The way food created community on the road. Because the medieval pilgrimage wasn't only a physical journey. It was a social journey. And food was one of the most important social tools pilgrims had. And when you start paying attention to how pilgrims ate together, you begin noticing something that doesn't show up in the romantic versions of history. Medieval pilgrimage was crowded. Not always, not everywhere, not every day. But along major routes, especially in peak seasons, the road could feel like a slow-moving river of people. Farmers. Widows. Young men seeking forgiveness. Old men seeking healing. Merchants combining trade with devotion. Nobles with servants. Begging pilgrims with nothing but a staff and a prayer. And when you have a river of strangers moving in the same direction, the most natural thing in the world happens. People start forming small groups. Not official groups. Not formal caravans. Just temporary communities. People who walk at the same pace. People who share a fire. People who share information. And often, people who share food. Food sharing on the medieval road wasn't always charity. Sometimes it was strategy. If you share with someone today, they might share with you tomorrow. If you share, you become part of the group. And a group is safer than a lone traveler. Not perfectly safe. But safer. So the simple act of breaking bread became something more than eating. It became belonging. And on a long road, belonging matters. Now, one of the most common shared meals was a pot meal. Something cooked in one vessel. Something everyone could contribute to. A handful of peas. A little grain. An onion. A scrap of meat. A pinch of salt. A bit of fat. And suddenly you have pottage. Not one person's pottage. Everyone's pottage. And the beauty of pottage is that it absorbs contributions. It welcomes scraps. It forgives uneven ingredients. It doesn't demand perfection. And that is why it became the medieval default meal, not just at home, but on the road. Pottage is a food that matches the medieval world. Flexible. Resilient. Unpretentious. Now, shared meals also reduced waste. If one pilgrim had bread but no protein, and another had cured meat but little bread, sharing created balance. And balance mattered because the medieval diet on the road could easily become lopsided. Too much salt. Too little fat. Too much grain. Not enough warmth. Not enough variety. So the road taught people cooperation. Not because they were saints. Because it was useful. Now, of course, not all sharing was peaceful. Food can create conflict as easily as it creates community. If someone took too much. If someone contributed too little. If someone was suspected of hiding better food. The medieval road was full of human behavior. Not idealized behavior. Real behavior. And hunger makes human behavior sharper. But even with conflict, the pattern remains. Food was social currency. A piece of cheese could be friendship. A bowl of stew could be trust. A shared onion could be conversation. And on a road where strangers slept close together in inns, monasteries, and barns, conversation mattered. Because conversation was how you learned. Where the next safe well was. Which town had a good inn. Which road was dangerous? Where bandits had been seen? Which bridge was out? Which monastery offered soup? Information traveled along the pilgrimage route like another kind of commodity. And food was often the price of that information. Now, speaking of inns, we need to talk about what medieval inns actually offered. Because modern people often imagine an inn as a cozy wooden building with a roaring fireplace, a smiling innkeeper, and a warm meal waiting. Sometimes that happened. Sometimes. But medieval inns were not consistent. Some were decent. Some were filthy. Some were overpriced. Some were basically barns with a roof. And food at inns depended entirely on what was available. Bread was almost guaranteed. Cheese sometimes. Ale almost always. A stew if you were lucky. And often, the stew was not a menu item. It was whatever was in the pot. Because medieval cooking was not about choice. It was about what existed. If you arrived late, the good food might be gone. If you arrived early, you might get something better. If you arrived during a festival, you might get something amazing. If you arrived during famine, you might get nothing. So pilgrims learned to never rely completely on inns. They used inns when they could. But they still carried their own survival foods. Now, another common food at inns was something that sounds oddly modern. A thick slice of bread used as a plate. This is where we get the concept of trenchers. Bread used to hold food. Sometimes the bread was stale, hard, meant for this purpose. A pilgrim might eat stew poured over a trencher. And after the meal, the bread could be eaten. Or given to the poor. Or fed to animals. Either way, the bread served two functions. Container and food. Medieval people loved multifunctional items. Because the medieval world was expensive. Resources were precious. And waste was a sin, culturally and religiously. Now, on the road, pilgrims also encountered markets. And markets were important because they offered something rare. Freshness. Not always, but sometimes. Fresh fruit. Fresh bread. Fresh vegetables. A pilgrim might arrive in a town and immediately seek a market, not for luxury, but for relief. A fresh apple. A fresh carrot. A handful of greens. Something crisp. Something alive. Because after days of dried food, the body craves freshness in a way that feels almost desperate. And medieval pilgrims understood that, even if they didn't have modern nutritional language. They knew that too much dried food made you feel heavy. Made you feel dull. Made you feel unwell. So when they could, they bought fresh items and ate them quickly. Not because they could store them. Because they couldn't. Freshness was a moment, not a possession. Now, another instant meal that appears on medieval pilgrimage routes is something that feels strangely comforting. A simple bowl of milk-soaked bread. If a pilgrim stayed in a place where milk was available, they might soak bread in milk. Or in whey. Or in thin broth. And this created a soft, easy meal. Especially for older pilgrims. Or sick pilgrims. Or pilgrims with poor teeth. And yes, poor teeth were common. Hard bread was not friendly to aging mouths. So soft meals mattered. They weren't just comfort. They were accessibility. Now, medieval travel food also included something we haven't fully discussed yet. Dried herbs and medicinal plants carried intentionally. Not just for flavor. For health. A pilgrim might carry chamomile. For calming the stomach. Or fennel. Or anise. Or mint. These could be brewed into a simple tea. And that tea served multiple purposes. Warmth. Hydration. Stomach relief. And the sense of control. Because when your body feels unstable on the road, a warm herbal drink feels like medicine. Even if it's mostly psychological. And psychology matters. Now, one of the great myths about medieval travel is that everyone was constantly starving. In reality, the medieval world had plenty of food at certain times. Harvest seasons could be abundant. Markets could be lively. But the real challenge was consistency. Not abundance. Consistency. Because a pilgrim's body doesn't care if there was a feast in the next town. It cares about whether you have calories today. So the pilgrim diet was built around consistency. And that is why dried foods were so important. Now, we need to talk about one of the most underappreciated medieval travel foods. And it's something we still eat today. Dried apples. Not just as fruit, but as a cooking ingredient. Dried apple slices could be eaten as they were. But they could also be boiled into a kind of sweet porridge. A pilgrim could drop dried apples into oats or barley. And suddenly, the meal tasted different. Slightly sweet. Slightly fragrant. And that small change could lift morale. It's a tiny detail, but medieval travel was made of tiny details. Now, another travel food was something that sounds odd but was common. Vinegar. Vinegar was used to flavor food. To preserve food. To clean. And to make drinks. A pilgrim might add a splash of vinegar to water or ale. Not for taste necessarily, but for the belief that it protected against illness. Vinegar was associated with cleansing. With protection. And in a world where illness was mysterious and terrifying, any sense of protection mattered. Also, vinegar made bland food taste sharper. And sharpness wakes you up. Now, as we move deeper into the pilgrim diet, we also begin to see the difference between planned meals and emergency meals. Planned meals are bread, cheese, peas, oats, cured meat. Emergency meals are whatever happens when something goes wrong. And medieval travel was full of things going wrong. You lose your bag. Your food gets wet. A dog steals your bread. Yes, this happened. A thief cuts your pouch. A river crossing ruins your supplies. Or you simply miscalculate. And suddenly you are hungry in the wrong place. That's when emergency foods matter. And one of the most common emergency foods was begging. Not glamorous. Not romantic. But real. Pilgrims begged. Sometimes because they were poor from the start. Sometimes because they had lost resources. Sometimes because they were injured. And pilgrimage culture included an expectation of charity. Not always fulfilled. But present. A pilgrim might receive a piece of bread. A bowl of broth. A handful of grain. A bit of cheese. And those small gifts could keep someone alive. Now, another emergency meal was gleaning. Picking up scraps. Fallen fruit. Leftover grains. Anything edible. Medieval travelers were not picky. Not because they lacked taste. Because survival makes you practical. Now, as the road continues, we should also acknowledge that pilgrimage routes were not one continuous line of danger. There were safe stretches. There were well-traveled roads. There were villages. There were farms. And farms sometimes offered food. A pilgrim might be given a piece of bread by a farmer. Or a cup of milk. Or an onion. Or a handful of apples. Not always. But sometimes. And these moments of kindness mattered. Because they reminded pilgrims that the world contained generosity. Not just hardship. Now, one of the most interesting things about medieval travel meals is how often they were eaten while moving. Modern people imagine meals as something you sit down for. Medieval pilgrims often ate while walking. A piece of bread in the hand. A wedge of cheese in the pouch. A dried apple slice. A handful of nuts. Food as motion. Eating as part of walking. Because stopping was not always desirable. Stopping meant losing time. Stopping meant risk. Stopping meant getting cold. So pilgrims learned to eat in small pieces, in small moments, while continuing forward. And this is one of the reasons their foods were so portable. Not because they were obsessed with convenience. Because their bodies were always in transit. Now, as the night deepens, we keep walking. The road stretches. The rhythm continues. Bread. Cheese. Salt. Oats. Peas. Fish. Fruit. nuts, honey, a little fat, a little spice, a little warmth when possible. And as the pilgrimage goes on, the road stops feeling like a place you travel through, and starts feeling like a world of its own. A moving world. A temporary civilization built out of footsteps. Because after enough days walking, you stop thinking in terms of home and away. You start thinking in terms of the next town, the next bridge, the next place you can eat, the next place you can refill your water. And that's when medieval travel meals become something deeper than food. They become time markers. Bread in the morning. A mouthful of cheese at midday. A sip of ale in the afternoon. A bowl of pottage at night if you're lucky. And if you're unlucky, bread again. Now, let's talk about the thing that medieval people almost never described as food, but treated as essential. Salt. Salt was everywhere in the pilgrim diet. Not just because it made food taste better. Because it made food possible. It preserved meat. It preserved fish. It preserved butter. It preserved vegetables. It preserved life. And on the road, salt also served another function. It kept the body stable. Pilgrims sweating all day needed minerals, even if they didn't understand it scientifically. They understood it through experience. They understood that without salt, you felt weak. They understood that certain foods revived you. And salted foods did. So pilgrims didn't just carry salt for flavor. They carried it like a tool. Like fire. Like rope. Now, there's something else that medieval pilgrims carried that modern people rarely associate with travel. Fat. Not in the abstract. Actual fat. Rendered fat. Lard. Dripping. Sometimes butter if it could survive the climate. Because fat is pure energy. It turns bread into a real meal. It turns grains into something that lasts longer in your stomach. And medieval bodies needed fat because the road burned calories relentlessly. So even poor pilgrims, if they could, tried to get fat into their diet. A bit of bacon grease. A chunk of salted pork. A spoon of butter. A smear of lard on bread. And yes, it sounds heavy. But if you're walking 20 miles a day, it becomes fuel. Now, this brings us to a strange and important reality. Medieval pilgrims didn't eat balanced meals. They ate what the road allowed. Some days they ate well. Some days they ate terribly. Some days they ate almost nothing. And their bodies responded. Pilgrims lost weight. Pilgrims gained muscle. Pilgrims developed hard, cracked hands. Pilgrims developed sunburn. Pilgrims developed sores. Pilgrims developed blisters. And their food became part of managing pain. Because food doesn't just feed you. It helps you tolerate discomfort. A warm meal at night can change the entire emotional shape of a day. A hot bowl of peas can feel like mercy. Now, one of the most common hot meals on pilgrimage routes was not meat. It was legumes. Peas. Beans. Lentils. Because legumes were cheap, storable, and filling. And they could be cooked into thick, sustaining stews. A pilgrim might carry dried peas in a pouch. And when they found a fire, they boiled them. Sometimes with onion. Sometimes with herbs. Sometimes with a scrap of meat. Sometimes with nothing. And the result was not glamorous. But it was deeply effective. Now, let's talk about one of the most overlooked aspects of medieval travel food. The smell. Modern people often forget that medieval travel was a sensory experience in a way we almost never deal with now. The road smelled like mud. Like sweat. Like animals. Like manure. Like wet wool. Like unwashed bodies. Like smoke. Like damp leather. And food was part of that smell. Cured meat smelled. Cheese smelled. Garlic smelled. Onions smelled. Salt fish smelled. And pilgrims carried these smells with them. So the road itself had a constant background of food odor. And in crowded inns, those smells mixed. The smell of 20 pilgrims' cheese pouches. The smell of dried fish. The smell of onions. The smell of stale bread. And the smell of bodies. It wasn't just unpleasant. It was the scent of movement. The scent of survival. Now, speaking of inns and crowded sleeping spaces, we need to talk about the way meals and sleep were connected. Because in medieval travel, food and rest were inseparable. If you ate well, you slept better. If you slept better, you walked better. If you walked better, you reached safer places. If you reached safer places, you ate better. It was a cycle. And pilgrims who broke that cycle, through injury, illness, bad luck, could spiral quickly. So pilgrims protected their ability to eat. And they protected their ability to rest. Now, another instant meal that medieval pilgrims used, especially when they had access to alehouses or monasteries, was thick bread soup. Not fancy. Not French onion soup. Just bread soaked in hot broth. Sometimes with herbs. Sometimes with garlic. Sometimes with a bit of fat. And this mattered because it was warm, quick, and easy to digest. If you were exhausted, bread soup could bring you back from the edge. Now, in warmer climates, pilgrims sometimes leaned on a different strategy. Cold meals. Because cooking in heat is miserable. So you see more reliance on olives, cheese, dried fruit, and bread. And in those regions, another travel food appears. Nuts. Almonds. Walnuts. Hazelnuts. Nuts were a perfect travel food. High energy. Long-lasting. Portable. And they could be eaten without stopping. They were expensive in some places, but not always. In regions where nuts were common, pilgrims used them constantly. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Because medieval pilgrims weren't just eating for survival. They were eating inside a religious framework. And medieval Christianity was obsessed with fasting. Not occasional fasting. Regular fasting. Frequent fasting. Some days you could eat meat. Some days you could not. Some days you could eat dairy. Some days you could not. Some days you could eat eggs. Some days you could not. And the rules varied by time and region. But the idea was consistent. Food was tied to discipline. So pilgrims sometimes had to plan around fasting days. That meant fish. That meant legumes. That meant bread. That meant oil. That meant avoiding meat even if it was available. And yes, people cheated. Of course they did. But the framework still shaped the culture of pilgrimage. Because pilgrimage itself was an act of penance. And food was one of the ways penance was performed. Eating simple food was part of the point. Now, that brings us to one of the strangest psychological aspects of medieval travel meals. Some pilgrims wanted to suffer. Not in a dramatic, theatrical way. In a sincere way. They believed suffering had spiritual value. So some pilgrims deliberately ate poorly. Deliberately ate bland food. Deliberately avoided comfort. Because they believed that hunger was cleansing. That discomfort purified the soul. And that idea sounds extreme to modern ears, but in the medieval mind, it made sense. If the world is full of sin, then discipline is a weapon. And food discipline was one of the easiest weapons to carry. Now, not everyone was like this. Many pilgrims wanted comfort. Many pilgrims wanted to eat well. Many pilgrims were not mystics. They were ordinary people with ordinary appetites. But the presence of the holy hunger mindset is important because it shaped pilgrimage culture. It made simple food respectable. It made bread and water symbolic. It made hardship meaningful. Now, as the road continues, the pilgrim also learns something else. How to recognize danger in food. Because medieval food safety was not modern food safety. Meat could be bad. Milk could be bad. Water could be bad. Fish could be bad. And the body paid the price. So pilgrims became cautious. They learned which inns were known for sickness. They learned which wells tasted wrong. They learned to trust certain monasteries. They learned to avoid suspicious stew. Yes. Suspicious stew. Because the medieval road was full of stew pots, and not all stew pots were safe. And the worst thing you could do as a pilgrim was get food poisoning. Because if you got sick on the road, you might not recover. Not because the illness was always fatal. But because weakness made everything harder. And the road did not pause for your weakness. Now, this brings us to the most universal medieval travel meal of all. The meal eaten in fear. The meal eaten quickly. The meal eaten without joy. Bread. Dry bread. Because bread was the fallback food. The last food. The emergency food. The food that never disappeared. Even when everything else did. And medieval pilgrims ate bread the way sailors ate hardtack. Not because they loved it. Because it was reliable. And reliability, on a medieval road, was more precious than flavor. And once you realize that, you start seeing the medieval pilgrimage route differently. Not as a line on a map. But as a living organism. A long, breathing corridor of hunger. Because pilgrims did not just walk through towns. They transformed them. Every steady pilgrimage road created the same thing, again and again, across Europe. Inns. Bakeries. Alehouses. Markets. Monasteries offering soup. Vendors selling cheap bread to strangers. A whole economy built around the fact that humans cannot walk for weeks without eating. And here's the strange part. Most medieval towns didn't get rich from pilgrims buying luxury. They got rich from pilgrims buying basic survival. The same few things, over and over. Bread. Cheese. Beer. Onions. Eggs. Sometimes dried fish. Sometimes a little meat. Sometimes a bowl of hot pottage. And because the demand was constant, the supply became structured. Pilgrimage routes made food predictable. Which sounds normal to us now. But in medieval Europe, predictability was rare. Now, let's talk about the food that was the most important on the road. And also the most misunderstood. Ale. Because modern people hear ale and imagine medieval people getting drunk all day. And yes, sometimes they did. But the bigger story is simpler. Ale was safe. Or at least safer. Because clean drinking water was not guaranteed. Wells could be contaminated. Streams could be contaminated. City water could be contaminated. But ale, being boiled in the brewing process, had a built-in advantage. It was processed. It was controlled. And even if the alcohol content was low, the drink was more trustworthy than random water sources. So pilgrims drank ale constantly. Not as a party. As a strategy. And because ale was so normal, it was sold everywhere. Inns. Roadside taverns. Village homes. Monasteries. And the pilgrim learned quickly. If you can't trust the water, trust the brew. Now, there's another drink that pilgrims relied on, especially in colder regions. Warm ale. Yes. Warm. Not chilled. Not crisp. Not refreshing. Warm ale, sometimes mixed with herbs, sometimes with spices if you were wealthy, sometimes with honey if you were lucky. And warm ale did something important. It calmed the body. It warmed the stomach. It gave you a sense of comfort in a world that was mostly cold, damp, and uncomfortable. If you have ever been exhausted and cold and finally gotten something warm inside you, you already understand why this mattered. Now, the next instant meal we need to talk about is the one that medieval pilgrims didn't always choose, but often ended up eating anyway. Whatever the inn served. And this is where the pilgrimage food story gets chaotic. Because medieval inns were not restaurants. They were survival stations. Sometimes they served a decent stew. Sometimes they served bread and cheese. Sometimes they served something that could only be described as hot and probably edible. And pilgrims had very little power to complain. You ate what was there. You ate what you could afford. And you ate quickly. Because inns were crowded, loud, and full of strangers. Now, if you were lucky, you got pottage. Pottage was the medieval miracle. A thick stew of whatever was available. Peas. Beans. Oats. Cabbage. Onions. Leeks. Herbs. Sometimes a scrap of meat. Sometimes bacon fat. Sometimes fish stock. It changed every day. Every pot was different. But the concept was stable. Boil plants until they become dinner. And because pottage could be made in large quantities, it was perfect for feeding groups. Which made it perfect for inns and monasteries. Now, let's talk about monasteries. Because monasteries were the closest thing medieval Europe had to a consistent travel network. Monasteries offered shelter. Sometimes food. Sometimes water. Sometimes medical care. Sometimes just a corner of the floor to sleep on. And if you arrived at a monastery as a pilgrim, there was a decent chance you'd receive a bowl of something hot. Not because monks were running a charity business. But because hospitality was part of the religious duty. Feeding travelers was seen as a holy act. So monasteries became food checkpoints. And the food they served was usually simple. Bread. Soup. Vegetables. Sometimes fish. Sometimes a little cheese. And for a hungry pilgrim, this was not simple. It was salvation. Now, we need to talk about one of the most powerful travel foods of the medieval world. Cheese. Cheese was portable milk. Milk that didn't spoil immediately. Milk that became solid. Milk that could travel. Milk that could survive. And medieval pilgrims carried cheese the way modern people carry protein snacks. It was compact. High calorie. High fat. High protein. And it did not require cooking. Now, the cheese itself varied. Soft cheeses spoiled faster. Hard cheeses lasted longer. So travel cheese was often aged. Dense. Salty. Strong. Sometimes so strong it could practically introduce itself before you opened the pouch. But that strength was a feature, not a flaw. Because salt helped preserve it. And aged cheese was more stable. Now, here's something medieval travelers understood instinctively. When you're exhausted, food that is dense matters. You don't want food that fills you with water. You want food that fills you with energy. Cheese did that. A small piece could carry you for hours. Now, another travel food that appears constantly on pilgrimage routes is dried fruit. Figs. Raisins. Dates in some regions. Apples, dried into rings. Pears. Plums. And dried fruit was not just a sweet treat. It was medicine. Because dried fruit gave quick energy. It gave fiber. It helped digestion. And when your diet is mostly bread and cheese, digestion becomes an issue. Let's be honest. Medieval travelers were not living their best intestinal life. So dried fruit helped. And it also gave morale. A bite of sweetness in a world of salt and smoke. Now, the road continues. And the pilgrim begins to encounter a different kind of food economy. Markets. Because medieval markets were not grocery stores. They were chaotic, loud, seasonal, and full of surprises. You might find fresh eggs. You might find onions. You might find a smoked fish. You might find a vendor selling little pies. You might find nothing but turnips and suspicious cabbage. But pilgrims loved markets because markets gave choice. And choice is rare on the road. Now, one of the most common instant meals pilgrims could buy in towns was something simple and beautiful. A small pie. Not a sweet pie. A meat pie, if you were lucky. Or a vegetable pie. Or a fish pie on fasting days. The crust acted like a container. The filling was the meal. And the pie could be eaten while walking. It was medieval fast food. Portable. Contained. And it didn't require you to stop and cook. Now, was it always safe? Not always. But when it was good, it was a gift. Now, the next travel meal is one that sounds unimpressive. Until you imagine it in the actual conditions. Roasted onions. Yes. Onions. Because onions were everywhere. They grew easily. They stored well. They were cheap. They could be eaten raw. They could be cooked quickly. They could be carried in a sack. And they gave flavor to everything. A pilgrim might eat bread, cheese, and onion. That was a meal. A pilgrim might throw onion into a pot of peas. That was luxury. A pilgrim might roast onions in the ashes of a fire. That was warmth and sweetness and comfort. And onions also had a reputation as protective. Medieval people believed onions helped with illness. They believed onions strengthened the body. And honestly, they weren't completely wrong. Now, let's talk about another quiet hero. Garlic. Garlic traveled well. Garlic added flavor. Garlic had medicinal reputation. Garlic kept meals from feeling dead. And garlic also had a social consequence. If you ate garlic on the road, everyone knew. Pilgrims did not smell like roses. They smelled like garlic and sweat and wool. And that became part of the pilgrim identity. Now, the road is long. And as the days pass, the pilgrim learns something else. How to ration. Because food on pilgrimage was not just about eating. It was about not eating too much. It was about planning. It was about resisting panic. Because hunger creates panic. And panic creates bad decisions. So pilgrims learned to measure food in handfuls. A piece of bread. A piece of cheese. A few nuts. A sip of ale. And they learned to stretch supplies. Now, there's another food that medieval pilgrims carried that modern people almost never talk about. Oats. Oats were cheap. Oats stored well. Oats cooked into porridge quickly. And oats could be eaten sweet or savory depending on what you had. If you had honey, oats became comfort. If you had salt and onion, oats became survival. And oats were especially common in northern regions. So if you were traveling through England, Scotland, parts of France, oats were a serious travel staple. Now, we need to talk about honey. Because honey was not just sweet. Honey was a preservative. Honey was a medicine. Honey was a morale booster. And honey could travel. A pilgrim might carry honey in a small container, or buy it when possible. And a spoon of honey could turn dry bread into something tolerable. It could turn oats into something comforting. It could soothe a sore throat. It could give quick energy. And honey was one of those rare foods that felt like kindness. Now, the road continues. And as we move deeper into the medieval pilgrimage world, we need to talk about one of the biggest threats to travel meals. Theft. Because food was valuable. Not symbolically. Literally. If you stole someone's food, you stole their survival. And pilgrimage routes were full of desperate people. Not everyone was a holy traveler. Some were criminals. Some were opportunists. Some were just hungry. So pilgrims guarded their food. They hid it. They slept with it. They tied their pouches. They kept bread under their cloak. Because losing your food meant your journey might end. And once you start thinking about food as something that can be stolen, you also start thinking about food as something that can't always be cooked. Because the medieval road did not give you consistent conditions. Some nights you had a fire. Some nights you had shelter. Some nights you had a monastery kitchen nearby. And some nights you had nothing but wet wind and a patch of ground that technically counted as not a swamp. So pilgrims had to build a diet that worked even when cooking failed. And that's where the true genius of medieval travel food appears. Not in fancy recipes. In redundancy. In backup plans. Bread that can be eaten dry. Cheese that can be eaten cold. Jerky or salted meat that needs nothing. Dried fruit that doesn't care about weather. Nuts that don't care about anything. And this is the part that modern people rarely appreciate. Medieval travel meals were designed for a world where plans collapse constantly. Now, let's talk about the act of cooking on the road. Because when medieval people cooked, it wasn't cute. It wasn't aesthetic. It wasn't camping. It was work. First you needed fuel. Wood. Dry wood, ideally. And depending on where you were, that could be easy or nearly impossible. In forests, wood was abundant. In open fields, not so much. In wet climates, wood existed but refused to cooperate. And in heavily traveled routes, wood near the road was often already picked clean. So pilgrims scavenged. They broke branches. They collected dried brush. They stole bits of wood when they were desperate. They used dung in some regions. Yes. Dung. Because fire is fire when you're cold. Now, once you had fuel, you needed something to cook in. A pot. And not every pilgrim had a pot. Pots were expensive. Pots were heavy. Pots were valuable. So many pilgrims traveled without cooking equipment. Which meant they depended on inns, monasteries, or shared cooking with other travelers. And that created an entire social system around food. Because on the road, if one person had a pot, they suddenly became important. Not a king. Not a knight. But a person with a pot. Which, in medieval travel hierarchy, was basically royalty. Now, if you did have a pot, your options expanded. You could boil peas. You could cook oats. You could make pottage. You could soften bread. You could boil water to make it safer. You could cook herbs. You could even make a crude broth from scraps. But even with a pot, you still needed time. And time was not always safe. Because the medieval road had another constant. Fear. Not always dramatic fear. Not always bandit-in-the-bush fear. Sometimes it was subtle fear. The fear of being caught outside after dark. The fear of sleeping in the open. The fear of being in a place where strangers watched you too closely. The fear of being far from help. So pilgrims often cooked quickly. They cooked simple. They cooked foods that didn't require long simmering. Because a pot sitting over a fire is a beacon. It's a signal. It says, someone is here. And if you're in dangerous territory, you don't always want to announce yourself. Now, let's talk about one of the most practical instant meals on pilgrimage routes. Cold pottage. Yes. Cold. Because sometimes you cooked a pot of peas or oats, and you didn't finish it. And the next day, you ate it cold. It sounds unpleasant. But cold pottage is calories. Cold pottage is stable. Cold pottage is food you don't have to cook again. And if you're trying to get moving early, before the road fills with strangers, cold food is efficient. Now, another medieval instant meal that shows up constantly is bread soaked in wine. Not fancy wine. Cheap wine. Thin wine. Sometimes watered down. But the idea was simple. Bread becomes easier to eat. Wine gives calories. Wine also disinfects slightly. And the result is a fast meal that requires no cooking. This was especially common in southern regions where wine was everywhere. Now, if you're thinking, that sounds like breakfast for a medieval adult who is emotionally exhausted, yes. That is exactly what it is. Now, another instant food pilgrims relied on, especially in poor conditions, was simply raw vegetables. Cabbage. Turnips. Radishes. Carrots, though less common. Leeks. And yes, raw cabbage on a long walk is not a glamorous snack. But it gave crunch. It gave moisture. It gave something living. And medieval people believed strongly that certain vegetables helped protect the body. And again, they weren't entirely wrong. Now, let's talk about fish. Because fish was everywhere in medieval travel meals. Not fresh fish, usually. Salt fish. Dried fish. Smoked fish. Because fasting rules made fish essential. And because fish preserved well. Now, salted fish was one of those foods that made everything else taste worse by comparison. It was intensely salty. It was often tough. It smelled powerful. And yet, it was incredibly valuable. Because it lasted. It traveled. It provided protein. And it could be eaten without cooking. Or, if you had a pot, you could boil it into broth. And that broth could then be used to soften bread, cook peas, or flavor oats. So salted fish wasn't just a food. It was an ingredient. It was a flavor engine. Now, here's something medieval pilgrims did that modern people rarely imagine. They reused cooking water. Not because it was delicious. Because it was efficient. If you boiled peas, the water had nutrients. If you boiled fish, the water had salt and flavor. If you boiled herbs, the water had something. And when water is heavy to carry and hard to find, you don't waste it. So a pilgrim might boil something in water. Eat the food. And keep the water. And later, they'd use it again. To soften bread. To cook oats. To make a crude soup. And yes, this is the kind of detail that makes modern people uncomfortable. But it is also the kind of detail that kept people alive. Now, as the pilgrimage continues, the body changes. And that changes the way food feels. At the beginning of a journey, you might crave variety. You might crave novelty. But after weeks of walking, you crave consistency. You crave the foods that don't surprise you. You crave bread. You crave warm broth. You crave something predictable. Because the road itself is unpredictable. So food becomes a psychological anchor. And this is why so many medieval travel meals are repetitive. Not because medieval people lacked imagination. Because repetition is calming. Now, let's move into one of the most overlooked parts of medieval travel meals. The morning. Because mornings on the road were brutal. You woke up cold. Your clothes were damp. Your joints hurt. Your feet were sore. You were stiff. And you had to start walking again. So morning food mattered. And morning food was usually simple. Bread. Cheese. A sip of ale. Sometimes porridge if you had time. Sometimes nothing if you were trying to leave quickly. Now, one of the most common morning meals for travelers was bread with a smear of fat. Lard. Dripping. Butter if you were wealthy or in a cold climate. Because fat in the morning gave long-lasting energy. It also soothed hunger. And it made bread less depressing. Now, if you were lucky, you had onions. If you were very lucky, you had a bit of smoked meat. If you were blessed by the universe, you had honey. But most mornings were bread. And the pilgrim learned to respect bread. Not as a food you choose. As a food you depend on. Now, as the day went on, the pilgrim's meal pattern shifted. Midday meals were often eaten while walking. Because stopping too long was risky. You could lose daylight. You could miss safe lodging. You could become a target. So midday meals were usually portable. Cheese. Dried fruit. Nuts. Bread. Sometimes a cold pie. Sometimes a strip of salted meat. And this is where the medieval pilgrim becomes surprisingly modern. They were basically eating trail mix. Not in a cute way. In a survival way. Now, evening meals were the goal. Evening meals were the moment you could finally stop. And that's when you wanted hot food. That's when you wanted pottage. That's when you wanted broth. That's when you wanted something that felt like a real meal. And this is why inns and monasteries mattered so much. Because they offered hot food. Not always good food. But hot food. Now, the road continues. And as it continues, we have to talk about what happens when the weather turns. Because weather was one of the biggest enemies of travel meals. Rain ruins bread. Rain ruins fire. Rain ruins morale. And once your bread gets wet, it becomes vulnerable. Mold. Rot. And the worst part is, wet bread feels like betrayal. Because bread is supposed to be stable. So pilgrims protected bread carefully. They wrapped it in cloth. They kept it inside bags. They kept it under cloaks. They kept it close to the body. Because the body is warm. And warmth keeps bread dry. And when food ran out, that's when the pilgrimage stopped being a spiritual journey. And became something older. Something animal. Because hunger strips away the story you tell yourself. It strips away the romance. It strips away the idea of sacred destinations. And it replaces all of it with a single question. Where is the next bite? Now, medieval pilgrims didn't always run out of food. Many planned carefully. Many traveled along popular routes where towns were frequent. But some pilgrims were poor. Some were unlucky. Some were robbed. Some were delayed by illness. Some were forced to take detours. And when that happened, hunger arrived like a shadow. Quiet at first. Then constant. Then loud. And hunger on the road is not the same as hunger at home. At home, hunger has options. On the road, hunger has threats. Because if you get weak, you walk slower. If you walk slower, you arrive later. If you arrive later, you risk sleeping outside. If you sleep outside, you risk cold, theft, violence, sickness. So hunger wasn't just discomfort. It was danger. Now, when medieval pilgrims felt hunger creeping in, they did something very human. They started bargaining with their own food. They rationed harder. They cut bread into smaller pieces. They saved cheese for later. They counted dried fruit like coins. They started eating less, even when they were already tired. Because they feared tomorrow more than they feared today. And that's a mental state modern people rarely experience. The anxiety of not knowing if you can eat again. Now, this is where medieval travel meals become deeply psychological. Because once hunger becomes fear, you stop enjoying food. Even when you have it. You eat quickly. You hide it. You swallow without tasting. You become suspicious. You become protective. And the road changes you. Now, let's talk about the emergency foods pilgrims turned to when they had nothing else. The first was begging. Yes. Pilgrims begged. Not always. Not all. But enough. Because medieval society had a strange relationship with pilgrims. Pilgrims were seen as holy travelers. But they were also seen as suspicious strangers. So begging could work. Or it could get you chased away. Some towns fed pilgrims. Some towns despised them. Some people saw pilgrims as a blessing. Some saw them as parasites. So begging was unpredictable. But when you were hungry, you tried. Now, another emergency food strategy was foraging. And this is where the medieval world becomes extremely dangerous. Because foraging sounds romantic. It is not. Foraging requires knowledge. And most pilgrims did not have detailed knowledge of every region's plants. So foraging was risky. You might find berries. You might find edible greens. You might find nuts. Or you might find something that made you violently ill. And illness on the road is worse than hunger. So pilgrims foraged cautiously. They relied on familiar plants. They relied on what locals showed them. They relied on what other travelers claimed was safe. And yes, sometimes that was wrong. Now, another emergency food was something that medieval travelers did not talk about proudly. Eating animal feed. Yes. Because on the road, you passed stables. You passed farms. You passed carts of oats meant for horses. And oats are oats. Grain is grain. If you are hungry enough, you look at horse feed differently. And some pilgrims did. They ate oats meant for animals. They chewed raw grain. They stole handfuls when desperate. They did what hunger makes people do. Now, this is not meant to paint medieval pilgrims as pathetic. It's meant to show the reality. Pilgrimage was not a gentle walk. It was a physically punishing journey through a world with very little safety net. So food became survival. Now, when pilgrims entered new regions, they encountered unfamiliar foods. And this is where the pilgrimage diet becomes surprisingly diverse. Because medieval Europe was not culturally uniform. A pilgrim from England traveling to Rome would pass through regions with completely different food habits. Different grains. Different breads. Different cheeses. Different fats. Different herbs. Different preservation methods. And the pilgrim had to adapt. Now, for example, in northern regions, butter was common. In southern regions, olive oil took over. And that changes everything. Because butter and olive oil feel different. Butter is heavy, creamy, comforting. Olive oil is sharp, fruity, sometimes bitter. So a pilgrim used to butter might find olive oil strange at first. But eventually, the body learns. Now, another regional shift was bread. Northern breads could be darker. Heavier. Rye-based. Oat-based. Southern breads might be whiter. Wheat-based. Sometimes flatter. Sometimes baked differently. So pilgrims experienced bread culture the way modern travelers experience coffee culture. Same concept. Different execution. And yes, some pilgrims complained. Because humans have always complained about food. Now, another regional shift was cheese. Some regions had soft cheeses. Some had hard cheeses. Some had cheeses aged in caves. Some had cheeses flavored with herbs. And pilgrims, if they had money, sometimes treated themselves. Because after weeks of travel, a different cheese felt like a miracle. Now, let's talk about one of the most interesting pilgrimage foods. Eggs. Eggs were portable. Eggs were nutritious. Eggs cooked quickly. And in towns, eggs were easy to buy. A pilgrim could buy a few eggs in a market, boil them quickly, and carry them. Boiled eggs are one of the most timeless travel foods in human history. The only downside is obvious. They break. And broken eggs in a bag become tragedy. So pilgrims carried them carefully. Now, there's another food that pilgrims bought constantly, and it was not technically food. Spices. Not in the modern sense of buying a spice rack. Spices as medicine. Spices as comfort. Spices as protection. Pilgrims sometimes carried small amounts of pepper, cloves, or other spices if they could afford them. Not to cook elaborate meals. To mask bad food. To make bland broth taste alive. To make stale bread feel less dead. And spices also had a symbolic value. They felt luxurious. They felt powerful. They felt like something from a bigger world. So a pilgrim who had spices felt, in a small way, less helpless. Now, here's something else pilgrims did. They shared food. Not always. Sometimes people were selfish. Sometimes people were cruel. But sharing was common. Because pilgrimage created temporary communities. Groups formed. People walked together. They protected each other. They talked at night. They traded stories. And they traded food. A piece of cheese for a handful of dried fruit. A bit of bread for a sip of ale. A strip of salted meat for an onion. Food became currency. And currency created relationships. Now, let's talk about the way pilgrims treated their food physically. Because medieval travel food was carried on the body. In pouches. In bags. In cloth bundles. And that meant it absorbed the scent of the traveler. The sweat. The smoke. The damp wool. So food was not just food. It was part of the pilgrim. It smelled like the road. And when you ate it, you tasted the journey. Now, that sounds poetic. But it also means your bread tasted like your bag. Your cheese tasted like smoke. Your dried fruit tasted like cloth. And medieval people accepted this. Because the idea of sealed packaging did not exist. So the pilgrims' meals were intimate. They were close. They were carried like personal objects. Now, as we continue, the road grows harder. Because eventually, every pilgrimage reaches the point where the traveler is no longer excited. The novelty wears off. The body is tired. The feet hurt. The weather feels personal. And the pilgrim enters the phase of travel where you stop thinking about the destination. And start thinking about survival day by day. And in that phase, food becomes even more important. Because food becomes the only reward you get. Not the cathedral. Not the relic. Not the holy site. The bowl of soup at night. The bread in the morning. The piece of cheese at midday. That is what keeps you going. And once the pilgrim reaches that phase. The phase where the road stops being a story and becomes a routine. They begin to notice something else. How often survival depends on other people. Because medieval travel was not an individual sport. Even if you walked alone, you were never truly alone. There were always other travelers. Other pilgrims. Other merchants. Other soldiers. Other beggars. Other strangers. And the road itself was a moving society. So food was never just something you ate. Food was something you negotiated. Food was something you received. Food was something you begged for. Food was something you shared. Food was something you defended. Now, let's talk about charity food. Because charity was one of the pillars of medieval Christianity. But charity was not soft. It was not modern, feel-good charity. It was structured. It was controlled. It had rules. And it had limits. Monasteries could feed pilgrims, but they couldn't feed everyone forever. Town hospitals could give soup, but only in certain amounts. Churches could distribute bread, but not endlessly. And pilgrims learned quickly how to navigate this system. They learned which places were generous. They learned which places were strict. They learned which places required proof of pilgrimage. They learned which places demanded prayers in exchange for food. Because yes, sometimes food came with spiritual paperwork. Now, one of the most common forms of charity food was bread. Simple bread. Sometimes with a little cheese. Sometimes with a bit of broth. Sometimes just bread and water. And for poor pilgrims, this was everything. It meant you could keep walking. It meant you didn't have to sell your cloak. It meant you didn't have to beg in the streets. It meant you didn't have to steal. Now, here's the part that's uncomfortable. Charity food was not always safe. Because the poor were often fed lower quality food. Stale bread. Thin soup. Scraps. And again, this is not because medieval people were uniquely cruel. It's because food scarcity was real. If you had limited resources, you saved the best for your household. You gave the rest away. So pilgrims sometimes ate food that was barely food. But it still mattered. Because even weak calories are better than none. Now, another form of charity food was something like gruel. Thin porridge. Oats boiled into water. Sometimes flavored with a little salt. Sometimes with herbs. Sometimes with nothing. And gruel is one of those foods that modern people use as a joke. But gruel kept people alive for centuries. It is cheap. It is fast. It is digestible. And when you are exhausted and hungry, digestible matters. Now, pilgrims also learned to use the language of holiness to survive. Because medieval society was deeply religious. So if you were a pilgrim, you could present yourself as someone doing sacred work. And that could open doors. A farmer might give you a piece of bread because feeding a pilgrim felt spiritually valuable. A village woman might offer soup because it felt like a good deed. A monastery might let you sleep inside because hospitality was part of their duty. So pilgrimage wasn't just a journey. It was a social identity. And that identity could be used as a tool. Now, that doesn't mean pilgrims were all honest. Some were. Some weren't. Some people pretended to be pilgrims to access charity. This happened constantly. So towns became suspicious. They developed systems to identify real pilgrims. Pilgrim badges. Letters. Signs. Proof. And if you didn't have proof, you might not get fed. Now, this created a strange paradox. Pilgrims were holy travelers. But they were also treated like potential criminals. And food was one of the places where that tension became visible. Because if a town fed every stranger, it could be overwhelmed. But if a town fed no strangers, it could be seen as unchristian. So towns balanced generosity and self-protection. And pilgrims lived inside that balance. Now, let's talk about one of the most consistent sources of pilgrim food. The road itself. Because medieval roads weren't empty. They passed farms. They passed orchards. They passed vineyards. They passed fields. And pilgrims sometimes took things. Sometimes with permission. Sometimes without. If you walk past an apple tree, and you are starving, your morality becomes flexible. And medieval people understood this. There were laws against theft. But there was also a cultural understanding that travelers might take small things. A handful of apples. A few nuts. A piece of bread. A sip of milk. And villagers tolerated some of it. Not always. But often enough. Now, another food that pilgrims encountered constantly was milk. Fresh milk. But milk is tricky. Milk spoils fast. So milk was usually consumed immediately, not carried. A pilgrim might stop at a farm and drink milk on the spot. And that would be a rare moment of freshness. A rare moment of something clean. And for some pilgrims, milk felt like being briefly returned to childhood. Now, as the pilgrim continues, the road becomes more crowded. Because pilgrimage routes had seasons. There were peak times. Religious festivals. Holy days. And during those times, roads filled with people. And when roads filled with people, food prices rose. Because demand increased. And medieval markets were not kind. So pilgrims learned to travel strategically. They learned to buy food before entering crowded regions. They learned to avoid expensive towns. They learned to ration harder near major shrines. Because shrine towns were famous for something. Not just holiness. Profit. Now, shrine towns were full of vendors. Vendors selling pilgrim badges. Vendors selling relic trinkets. Vendors selling food. And the food was often overpriced. Because pilgrims were hungry and desperate. So shrine towns became medieval tourist traps. And the pilgrim learned to survive them. Now, one of the most common foods sold near shrines was bread rolls. Small breads you could eat while walking. Sometimes flavored with herbs. Sometimes plain. Sometimes with a little fat. And these breads were the medieval equivalent of buying snacks at an airport. Expensive. Not amazing. But you buy them anyway because you need something. Now, another common shrine town food was roasted meat. Yes. Meat. Because even though fasting rules existed, shrine towns often had celebrations. And celebrations meant meat. Roasted pork. Roasted chicken. Sausages. And for pilgrims who had been eating mostly bread and peas, the smell of roasted meat was almost unbearable. It was temptation. It was joy. It was torture. Now, some pilgrims ate it. Some resisted. Some couldn't afford it. But the presence of meat at the destination is important. Because it shows something. Pilgrimage was hardship. But it was also reward. And food was part of that reward. Now, let's talk about the moment a pilgrim finally arrives. The moment they see the cathedral. The shrine. The holy site. And their body is exhausted. Their feet are damaged. Their clothes are filthy. Their hair is tangled. They smell like the road. And they are hungry. Because even at the destination, hunger doesn't stop. So what do they eat? Often. The same things. Bread. Cheese. Ale. Soup. Because the destination didn't magically transform the food supply. It just concentrated it. But there was one difference. At the destination, the pilgrim sometimes ate with gratitude. Not just because the food was better. But because the journey was done. And that emotional shift changes taste. A bowl of soup at the end of a pilgrimage tastes different than a bowl of soup on day 5. Because at the end, you feel relief. And relief is a seasoning. Now, say continue and I'll keep flowing into the return journey. Yes, pilgrims had to go home. The way bodies broke down from travel diet. And the quiet truth about what most pilgrims actually remembered from their journey.